Hello, everybody. We're doing things a little differently today. We do a monthly show with Bethanne Patrick, who is my friend and the best read woman and man, I think, all man in the world. She's the literary reviewer for the Los Angeles Times. We usually do a show about best books of the month, but we've had the great fortune to get the great Andrew O'Hagan on the show, the author of Caledonian Road. Both Bethanne and I love the book. So we thought we would go three ways this month and invite Andrew on. Andrew O'Hagan doesn't need much of an introduction. So I think I'll turn over to Bethanne to do the introductory question, Bethanne.
Introductory question to the great Andrew O'Hagan. Well, Andrew, I'm just going to say before I ask my question that I've been reading your pieces for years in the London Review of Books, or LRB, as we all shorten it to. I just want to make sure people in the States don't think I'm talking about the Los Angeles Review of Books, which is, a completely different thing. But Caledonian Road is a very complicated and very rich novel about quite contemporary times in London. And one of the things that caught my eye as I was reading is a character who mentions they all wanted a life that outshone the truth. And it made me think, I don't want to get into any of this, Andrew. It made me think of some of the scandals we've seen this week. Scandals, if it might not be the right word, the very sad news about Alice Munro, the Canadian writer, and Neil Gaiman, the great British writer. We all want to outshine our truth in a way. And that can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. In Caledonian Road, you have characters who are striving to do so and fail, and characters whom I think might actually succeed. What do you think about those characters?
Well, it's lovely to be with you too, Andrew and Bethanne. I must say, I'm a fan of the show, and it's brilliant to have the opportunity to relax and talk to you, especially about this new book. It was 10 years in the making, and there was a labor of love from beginning to end. And of course, during those 10 years, the world changed enormously, and the book went with it. I kept having to shunt the action forward and reknit the detail in a new way, because I wanted to absorb austerity and Brexit and the migrant crisis, and of course, what had been happening with Donald Trump in the United States. And it's that name that comes up immediately, Bethanne, in response to your point when we talk about us wanting to live beyond reality. I'd have to say right away that we've had malign political influences on this tendency over our adulthood. I think the last 20 years have witnessed a change in the political culture in all of our nations pretty much, where the people who have gained power are people who really don't respect common everyday reality anymore. So it was only natural that fiction makers would rush in behind that and try to write about lives affected by this discontent, you might call it, disaffection with the ordinary truth. Fake life, fake news, fake history, a sense of invention and fictionality has suddenly engulfed us. And novelists, I would argue, and of course I would, are the frontline correspondents in this particular battle. All of our novels, I think, have to some extent been changed by the fact that the ground that we stand on, the environment that we all move in, has become unreliable. It's become questionable. And that comes from politics primarily. You've mentioned today some controversies involving writers. Actually, very few stories come up in the lives of writers that are as alarming, in my view, than the daily political cultures that we're living in now. I speak to you as a man only 24 hours away from getting on a plane to go to Milwaukee to cover the Republican National Convention, where there will be, for 4 days, a great display of, shall we say, disaffection or disrespect for what other people will call reality. And that's a fiction maker's job to, if you like, engage with that.
Well, I want to go back to the book for just a moment because I know Andrew Keene is going to be talking with you about the convention coverage, in at least to some extent. But in speaking about fiction, I want to make sure that we mention your protagonist, Campbell Flynn, who is,
Yes.
like you, a Scot, and his own mother, Alma, is someone who actually lives in her own fiction. And that, I think, is very interesting in what you're saying, because this is something, it might have some political ties, but it's very much born out of trauma. It's very much born out of other things that fiction makers do.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it's born out of trauma in the politicians too. But
Yes.
let us do as you advise and stick with Campbell's life. I mean, I think initially I saw a character for whom everything was going right in his life.
Yes.
He has this amazing career. He's a hugely respected art critic. He's a healthy man. He's a beautiful, interesting therapist wife, 2 children who are high achievers.
Yes.
He's the kind of guy who one day he writes for the New Yorker, the next day he's hosting a magnificent, much respected podcast. He's welcome on any show at the BBC. He's a teacher, much loved, at a major university. What's wrong with this guy, you might say? He seems to have everything.
Yeah.
Yet there is something wrong with him. He's falling apart internally. He's falling backwards into a kind of unknowable void. This man, who is a sort of everyman in my mind, because he represents to me so many of the men that I've known very well, including, by the way, myself.
Thank you for saying that, because, of course, that was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, is how much Campbell Flynn, resembles you, because it is fun at first to
I bet
think.
you've never had that question before, Andrew.
It's a perennial question, but it's a very important one for those of us who shamelessly steal from our own autobiographies in book after book, different aspects of our lives. But I have to tell you something that surprised me in the creation of this book, which was, although there are fundamentals that I have in common with the 52-year-old Scotsman, Campbell Flynn, in the end, he had much deeper troubles than, touchwood, I have yet to encounter. I had to invent a kind of an instability and an unhappiness that went very profoundly back into his life. It's a sort of black backing on the mirror that allows him to see his own face, is that childhood in Scotland of kind of dismaying coldness, distance, anxiety. He's never really resolved these questions. And though this spectacular success in his adulthood career, he isn't able to get over some part of himself which is dragged, as Scott Fitzgerald famously said, ceaselessly into the past.
I love that you mentioned Fitzgerald, because talk about trauma in the creative life. And one of the things that Elizabeth, Campbell's lovely wife, who has her own things to deal with, says to him about his very popular best-selling book about Vermeer, you didn't get, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically you didn't get to the search for the drama of the creative self.
Yeah.
And one of the things, you say you do resemble Campbell in some ways, but also you've given him this dream life of the pundit. Like, as you said, he can go on any show, he can write for any, and it's fun and candy colored at first. But Elizabeth hits the proverbial nail on the head when she says, you're not looking deep enough.
She does. She touches an open nerve. In a sense, she's the perfect partner. You would hope that, as well as a fantastically interesting and brilliant and beautiful partner, in an ideal world, you'd also have somebody who would touch the nerve when the nerve had to be touched, who pointed out things about yourself that you couldn't quite bear to confront. And Elizabeth does that with Campbell. Campbell is kidding himself. Yes, he has the perfect career. Yes, things seem to have gone so well. He seems like an escape artist from his dark past, but she's a therapist and she understands that he hasn't escaped. He's simply taken that trouble shell-like on his back through his life. And she's
Andrew, given that she's a therapist, maybe he's her subject or her client. It was her, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was her idea in the book, or it's her idea for him to write the book about Vermeer, which suggests that there was no Vermeer self, that everything is unknowing. Campbell's unknowing, Vermeer's unknowing, Rembrandt's unknowing.
It's a very good point.
Was it a therapeutic form of strategy for her? Or wasn't it digging a deeper ditch for Campbell to escape himself?
I must say, I've never been asked that. And it is a really interesting question, that, because I think she sets a kind of test for her husband by asking him, encouraging him to write a book about, essentially about a person who doesn't have a history. The one thing we know about Vermeer, other than that this man allegedly created these 30-odd masterpieces, is that we know nothing about his life. We know nothing about his interior life, his living circumstances. We believe that he was married, although we can't be sure. We don't know about his family life really at all. There are 5 or 6 minor things known about Vermeer, the great painter. And by encouraging him to write about a void, to write his way into a nothingness, I think the therapist in Elizabeth is encouraging him to confront something empty in himself.
And I have to now jump in and say, before we move on to some more political and class-based ideas, that you have it is an inescapable symbol at the heart of this book, which is when Elizabeth and Campbell confront the fishy smell in their house, in their home. And the fishy smell, of course, is finally discovered by Campbell to be an old box of fish fingers that has grown maggots, and they're just tumbling out of it. It's horrible. And we never know exactly how it got there, do we?
Well, I think the reader has a very strong sense by that point of how they got.
No spoilers, Andrew.
No spoilers, but there is, shall we say, a malign force living nearby.
Yes.
Who may, I think we can fairly say, be against the Campbells and their optimistic, prosperous life. She doesn't see this neighbor, the detail in their lives. To her, they are just symbols of this kind of new wealthy class in London. The book's a moral adventure about money in some respects.
Yes.
It's about capital. It's about what happens in a big city over a couple of decades when the houses grow unfeasibly and, to some minds, unseemly in their value. And suddenly these people who are ordinary middle-class people and academics and so on are millionaires. And they're millionaires because of the houses that they're sitting in. I watched that happen in London and always knew that someday there would be a big entertainment, a big generational adventure, a moral adventure set at the heart of what it's like in a community when that happens. I have lived in those streets where ordinary, perfectly lovely London houses such as exist in major cities across the world became gold mines. Right. What happened to the people surrounding those gold mines? What happened to the people who were renting across the road, or who lived in the next street, or indeed who might have lived in the basement or in the attic of such properties? That was a major dramatic turning point for me when I realized that you could write a gripping book, which at its heart had all these characters and their psychologies and their relationships, but ultimately they were defined, each of them, by money and by class. And that's where I think a lot of the interaction of a dramatic sort comes in the book, that these people who should be actually rubbing along rather well in a contemporary city that has its ups and downs, but it isn't a third world country. It's not a place suffering drought and famine. This is a place with problems, but it's a more or less well-to-do Western city. Yet the differences between the people living in this novel and living in this city are immense. And that's where the drama, I think, really finds its point.
Could we just quickly, Andrew, go back to Vermeer? Is there, in your view, a connection between the remarkable concreteness, the almost what appears to be the photographic quality of his art, and of course books have been written about that, and the fact that we don't know anything about him? Is there a connection between knowing and not knowing, between empirical fact and mystery, between reality and metaphysics in that sense?
I think it's a core energy in Caledonian Road, what you're describing, both of you. And Vermeer isn't accidentally chosen
No,
as
I can
just
imagine you.
as
You
a
took some,
valuable.
liberties with him. He'll be turning in his grave if he has a grave.
That's right, if he has a grave. We don't even
Schrodinger's Vermeer.
Yes. No, it was very deliberately chosen because, as you've indicated, at the center of our experience of Vermeer's paintings is the question of perspective. It's reality almost transcribed onto the canvas, it seems, and yet when you begin to look at those pictures again and again, what you see is a distortion, a trickery of perception. It's almost a trick of the light that we imagine that the jug is being held in that particular way, with the light seeming to touch the rim and the handle in her fingers and her eyelids in such a way. It seems like a miracle, but actually it's a piece of very brilliant, one would say genius level trickery to do with perception. And that became a central energy in this book, because you look at Campbell Flynn one way, he seems like the ultimate successful guy. You look at him from another perspective, and he's a disaster area. And that's true of so many of the characters in the book. Young actors who seem beautiful or handsome and successful and, eminently, enviable are actually delusional sometimes.
And in a sense, it's also true of capitalism itself. I mean, obviously, you
Yes.
play on the beginning on the Dutch pioneering a certain kind of financial capitalism, and Vermeer and Rembrandt being epiphenomenon consequences, or perhaps participants in that. So it's all bound up in the same sort of meta-historical narrative.
It really is. I mean, I think that you have a novel in your hands when every single strand, every thread in the carpet relates to the thread beside it, and ultimately to the overall design. When we look at a beautiful carpet, we don't really think about the individual threads and the work that went into the weave and the weft. What we see is the overall result, and we want to just luxuriate, to sit up an armchair on it and sit there. But actually, it's like that with a novel, that the work that goes into it becomes invisible, but yet all the strands should relate to each other. And for me, you're quite right. What you would say about Vermeer and about perception, and also about individual characters and their self-perception or their way of looking at each other, is also true of capitalism itself, which again, in my view, and certainly in the view of the speakers in this book, is another sleight of hand. It's a form of trickery where people who seem very well off might actually be impoverished of spirit. They might be in their sense of self-worth.
Or impoverished of bank account, Andrew,
yes.
as we see. And I want to actually go over to some characters who have had experience of life outside of capitalism. The Polish characters in the novel, who include, and Russian. We haven't even gotten there yet, Andrew Keen. We need to talk about the oligarchs too. But let's talk about Mrs. Krupa for a moment, and her sons and her daughter, and what it's like for her as someone who, I'm never going to be able to say the actual place name correctly. Bialystok.
Yeah.
Oh, good. And so she, remembers a life, even if she doesn't speak about socialism or communism, she remembers a life that had a different flavor. And it goes through not just to Bojdar, but also to Yakub. And he really interests me, Andrew, because one of the things he asks, does he say it to Boz or to someone else? He wants to grow vegetables at this farm where they're growing, samphire, or, it's a weed production house. And yet he still has this need that comes from a much different way and pace of life to grow his own food. And I thought that was such an interesting contrast to what was going on with the sort of, gangster money that he was involved in, as well as the capitalism.
Well, it's again a lovely question, that, because it spots something which I think is so important to people's pleasure in reading the book, is that it is an urban novel, and it's very much a novel about political change and big money, but it's also at some other level a book about the relationship between urban experience and country experience. Jacob is desperate for a kind of pastoral, bucolic life of growing plants, a simpler life. He comes from a formerly communist country, which his experience of industrial and deindustrialization has dominated his parents' lives and the lives of his country. Moving on to a notion of pastoral England, that's the England that's in Jacob's head. It may be a fantasy. I mean, he and his boyfriend, again, no spoilers, but they're aiming to come to London. It's full of sort of, handsome football players and beautiful countryside and amazing pop stars, and, but fundamentally a place where Jacob could come and be a gardener. And that notion of England, which even Dickens shied from, as the ultimate London novelist, there is this sense when people think of England, they don't always think of Manchester in London and Birmingham. They think of the Cotswolds or Sussex or Suffolk or, Cornwall, these great rolling fields and ancient churches. And I think that Jacob represents a little counterinsurgency in the book. He wants some sort of pastoral, easy life in England that he's never had in Poland.
Mm-hmm.
Gosia and her family, they're post-war refugees, really. They came to London. She came to London with her husband in the early 80s as part of that post-solidarity, move out of Poland. But I think that which she never really is able to accept is that the world that she left behind is an unresolved place for her. She, I think, leaves, I don't think it's giving too much away to say that both Jacob and, I think, Mrs. Cropper are to some extent lost in a false notion of what England is.
Yes.
And it emerges slowly through the book how that is, but I think it is the case.
And does that, in a way, hang over the whole book, including perhaps all of us, you, Andrew, and perhaps other progressives? There is this deep nostalgia about the book. You mentioned all the towns. One of the most emotional scenes in the town was in Leicester, where the Polish, I don't know what you would call him, the Polish migrant,
yes,
got a laminated union card, which he cherished and treasured and became one of the few things left. Is there an element of that? I'm sure you've been accused of that, Andrew, of perhaps in this book and in other work of being over sentimentalizing the old working class and the old industrial traditions of Britain and of
I think it would be a pity if it was viewed that way, really. I mean, Andrew, ultimately, it is part of our social history. I know that it's not a fashionable part of our political culture now. Unions and workers' rights and community centres and working men's clubs and women's solidarity around strikes and so on, which was a big part of my youth. I mean, I'm not 115 yet, and I can remember within, 40 years ago, during the miners' strike here in the UK, encountering women and helping women who were gathering groceries to support their husbands through the strike, the famous miners' strike of 1984 to 85. There is room for sentimentality in that, but there's good sentiment, I think, as opposed to bad as well in it, that we must remember our social history. It didn't all start with Margaret Thatcher and men drinking champagne in the streets of London whilst wearing red braces and looking forward to their Christmas bonus. That's one aspect of Englishness, but there are other aspects, and we may see, given that we've now got a large majority for a Labour government in this country, we might see a revival of some of those things which you suggest are possibly interpretable as nostalgia, but maybe they were just values that were on ice. I'm talking about values to do with people who work in a factory having rights, as opposed to the Bangladeshi women in the factory in Leicester that I describe and evoke in this novel. Those women who are working during COVID, passing garments and tools to each other without proper protection, they fundamentally turned out to have the largest number of deaths to COVID in Britain. That's what led me to them. I went there physically to find them as a writer because I'd heard that the biggest number of deaths was among Bangladeshi women working in factories. And that factory in Leicester, I think, should shock and shame those of us who feel that workers' rights and solidarity around the experience of employees is a thing of the past. I hope it's not a thing of the past. And I hope that the book enlivens the debate around what is acceptable, decent human working conditions.
You know, we like to sentimentalize, in the United States at least, the idea that that is of the past. We, watch movies and read books about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
Yes.
Oh, that doesn't happen anymore. Well, yes, it does.
Yes, it does.
As you're saying, people can die of COVID because of working conditions. And I dare say that there were probably many deaths in New York sweatshops that were not as visible.
It's one of the things I think that can be said of the broadly described social novel, both in the United States. If you look at Dos Passos or Theodore Dreiser, those turn of the 20th century brilliant social novelists describing economic and social conditions in America at that time, and equally over here in the UK with the famous example Dickens. Dickens is always being accused of being sentimental, and of course he caricatures class differences to a great extent as part of the enjoyment and the drama of his books, and perhaps all of us could be accused of that. But what he also does, beyond, as it were, Joe the crossing sweeper and too many tears garlanded around the poor, which you sometimes find in Dickens, there's also a really wonderful inquiry into social conditions in Victorian England. If you're going into an orphanage in a book by Dickens, you will see inside an orphanage. If you're going inside a school in the north of England, Dotheboys Hall, you will see just what the conditions in workhouses and orphanages and schools are. And I think that's got to be maintained in the social novel, is we shouldn't be embarrassed that we're going to be accused of sentimentalizing just because the social reality is a little bit tear-jerking. Because let me tell you, when you're researching some of these characters and these topics, you end up in situations that are almost too deep for tears. They're beyond belief.
But the only coherent alternative, it seems from the book at least, or maybe a couple of concrete political alternatives to the kind of corrupt capitalism, profoundly corrupt capitalism that you write about in the book, is either a kind of crypto utopianism, which you seem to parody mostly, and most of us would parody, and of course changed dramatically probably in the 10 years you were writing the book. And then a kind of rural utopianism, an escape. The idea that we can get away from it all, go to a Scottish island, start again, grow vegetables, create a utopian community. There aren't concrete political alternatives, and maybe there just aren't any, offered in the book. Did you feel that you should have provided one, or is that not really the job of a writer?
I don't think it's the job of a novelist to give answers. I think it's the job of a novelist to raise original and, if possible, brilliant questions. In the end, your imagination is as alive as mine, I suspect. At least that's my working assumption with good readers, is that they will complete the equation. They will think, well, what is the way out of this? Where is the arrow pointing out of Caledonian Road to? Of course, as you mentioned, cryptocurrency utopias, rural idealism to do with Scottish Islands and, pantheistic notions of communities in the countryside. Well, these can all be played with, and they have always been played with by people looking at idealism out of the urban disaster. But it's not for me to point the arrow and say, no, it's definitely here. I'm not a politician. I'm not a solver of these problems, but I would like to think that I animate fully the possibilities of the disturbance, of the entertaining parameters, if you like, of our current situation. And then we can then all go to the pub forever and argue about what to do.
Although, to come back to the 19th century and the original social realist books, there was always the promise of socialism, maybe not Dickens, I don't know, Zola, the Russian novelists. So Marx, of course, famously said, history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. There is that farcical quality that there doesn't seem to be, to misquote Mrs. Thatcher, there doesn't seem to be any alternatives.
Well, I think there is. If you look at these characters with real empathy, what you see is that they're living lives in which trying to work out what the answers will be is the vitality of their day. That is the substance of their lives. They're not by and large religious characters, not in this novel, although some of the novels you could mention take on these questions that you're rightly bringing up, Andrew, at the level of spiritual or religious experience. But for those of us who live in a post-Nietzschean world, you might say, a post-existentialist world, even if we want to really get to grips with the philosophy, perhaps some of those options look depleted to us. So we're looking for new forms of self-help, which is parodied, new forms of fiscal responsibility, which is
Men crying
parodied.
in their cars, right?
Men crying in their cars.
Why men weep in their cars.
I mean, that's the title for listeners of a book that my central character writes, a self-help book he writes in 6 days as a money-making exercise, but it goes to the core of some of his problems, but also, we might say, the problems of the culture, that religion has largely been replaced in many people's lives, busy daily lives, by self-help, by a kind of low-grade spiritualism to do with mindfulness. Now, all of that is not only parodiable and entertaining, I hope, in current novels, but also it points the direction we might go in or away from to find true new systems of living. You're right. In the 19th century novels, Zola and so on, they didn't, by the way, very often have a socialist nirvana at the end of the book. There's no socialist nirvana at the end of Therese Racan. There's no socialist nirvana at the end of Dostoevsky either. But what there is I think, quite an enriched sense of the size of the problem. And I know that sounds vaguer than you want, but if you want novelists to come up with solutions, then we should perhaps elect them into government. Plato would approve. I don't know that I would, though.
Well, we'd also have to pay novelists a lot more in that case. But, one thing that absolutely is not solved in Caledonian Road, and I want to point it up because you have, and big applause, won the Orwell Prize for 2020.
I didn't win it. I was nominated for
it. Pardon me for getting that wrong, but still great honor. Thank you. There's an utter failure in this novel of bureaucracy. And well, at least in terms of Campbell's housing difficulties. And I thought that was really an interesting way to look at it, not because you're trying to say bureaucracy is terrible or evil necessarily, but it doesn't help with certain kinds of things. And for instance, mental health issues. When someone is desperately, has a problem that cannot be solved by paperwork, by pushing, a permit here and an order for repair here, what do we do? And it's very difficult to get from one agency in a government to another.
Again, lovely to think about these questions because, the novel was a long time in the making and so many things poured into it and became live in the center of this big, nearly 700-page book. And bureaucracy for me was always, mainly a comic energy, because middle-class people in urban places now, not only in urban places, but especially because there's more traffic, there's more, there's more permits, there's more rules.
Yes.
The daily frustrations of the middle class in an urban space could be a whole series of Balzacian novels on their own.
Yes.
When you speak to middle class people about their frustrations, they're usually talking about bureaucracy. That they got a parking ticket, that they were kept on the phone to British Gas for 5 hours listening to music. Everything they talk about is about the horror of bureaucracy to make their lives less easy or indeed much harder.
Medical, the National Health Service.
The National Health Service, the queues, the forms, the paperwork. Talk to any teacher now. It's the form filling, any academic.
Yes.
It's the endless business of being online, marking and assessing and self-assessing and being assessed by your students. The world has become a kind of Kafkan nightmare of ultra response to and assessment to the idea of, are you actually doing well? You can't buy a, bottle of lemonade now without being asked for feedback. And especially if you're online, sort of innocently sort of wander into a sort of shopping zone and buy yourself a packet of pencils. And within seconds of making your purchase, you're asked for your assessment of how well they did.
Yes.
It's all bureaucracy. And I wanted that to be part of the comic pressure on the book, because here's a guy, to go back to our central character, here's a guy who lives, let's be clear, in a £7.5 million house, yet he goes to the local council to argue about the needs and claims of a person renting from him, over whom he's a landlord, who really has none of the advantages he has, but is absolutely framed as the kind of evil character of the piece. Now, he's willing to wade through bureaucracy, thinks it's all a terrible mistake in bureaucracy that he's having to deal with this. But he doesn't stop for a second, and maybe this is one of the things behind Campbell's trouble. He doesn't stop, does he, often enough to say, let me measure my privilege against other people's needs.
Right.
And I would argue that, to take up again Andrew's point about politics, there are subcutaneously political questions being asked in this novel all the time. How good are you, being one of them? How willing are you to pay your taxes in an honest way? How willing are you to see your equity as something that might do good beyond you and your family? And when I look at the aristocracy or the Russian oligarchs, what I see is self-interest as a form of high philosophy. That's where we've come to. And I certainly don't have an answer as to how we vanquish that overnight, politically or otherwise. But it seems to me to be both comic and tragic at the same time.
It certainly is both of those things at the same time. And that is one of the things that propels Caledonian Road forward, is that you do have those moments of comedy where you can take a rest and say, oh my word, what is this character doing? And for instance, I know we still need to talk about the oligarchs, but let's talk about the aristocrats for a moment, because they provide a great deal of the comic relief. For example, we have a mater familias who spends all of her time on a cruise ship because, being on dry land, well, then she might have to deal with some of, her inadequacies. We've got a child who has used all of her family money to start this wellness center. And I just laughed so hard when she started talking about some of the new treatments, the sake bath, for example. That's, I'm somewhat of a moderate aficionado of spa treatments. And I just thought,
well, I have some news for you. All of them are real.
All of them are real.
You have to research the book, I'm sure.
I mean, the endless amount of time I spent with wellness coordinators, with therapists, and at these places in the English countryside where they endlessly offer you the sake bath or the slug slime facial or whatever it's called.
The nail slime facial.
Yes,
snail.
All of that was thoroughly discovered by me rather than invented. I saw it out there in the world, and I did spend quite a lot of time with those aristocrats at polo matches and at special events and festivals and dinners and horse racing meets and so on. And I studied it up closely, not only to caricature them, because I hope that everybody is caricaturable right across the whole class system, and also rescuable, arguably. But they gave me so much material for free without even trying, the aristocrats. It's just like that. Oligarchs and aristocrats can't stop giving to novelists. You spend time at a dinner with a group of oligarchs. I mean, I had to, at one point, I'm not kidding you, I ran out of memory in the situation. I had to go to the bathroom, and I wrote notes on the cuff of my shirt. They were saying,
oh my God,
no. Abominable, ordering wine that was so abominably high priced and being so careless about their fellow humanity that I had to take notes. I spoiled several white shirts by writing on the sleeves. That's what it was like with them. They come at you with incredible full character and abominable dialogue. And for a novel,
Andrew, the book obviously is about Britain more than anything else. Cameron is British through and through, for better or worse. The one character who seemed to always be in the background in this book, but didn't really appear, I was waiting for this character to appear, was the United States. Cameron was driven by the kind of US cultural economy of the Atlantic and Harper's and the New York Times, an economy that you're now part of.
yes.
It's the kind of big brother in the way that England is the big brother to Scotland. The one positive political ideology, it seemed in the book, came from Selma, came from some African-American thinkers. And yet America never appears. Britain is lost. It's lost Europe. It hasn't found America. Am I wrong to think that America is always oddly in the background of the book as both a savior and a warning?
I think that's exactly how many of us here in Britain experience America, as the sort of as the older cousin who went wrong. You know, that we all, when I was growing up, there was always a cousin. He was usually called Jim. He smoked, he drank, he went to London. You know, we used to think about him and wonder what his big life must be like. And then you discover years later, when you actually came to London, that he was sitting, you know, drunk and absolutely sort of reduced in some bar in King's Cross. That was my experience of the uncle who went wrong.
On the Caledonian Road, of course, or at the end.
Probably, yes. And indeed, that is how I think, and many of us, I think, experience America now, that this place of shining possibility, of endless experimentation in the areas of democracy and human value and cohabitation and glamour, suddenly sort of hits what seems like a stupendously awful period of self-immolation, of self-destruction. And I wanted it to be the kind of raging fire that was just off camera in this novel. That, yes, references were made to it. Yes, notions, especially that the young guys had, the young rappers, who draw so much of their kind of pop cultural energy from America, their sense of value from America. They nonetheless are stranded on these islands, you know, thousands of miles away, whilst there's a fire raging elsewhere. And the fire is America. It's a whole other novel for me. And I didn't want to bring it in, Andrew, central focus, because I thought it would have unsettled Caledonian Road, that the business of Trump and what's happening to democracy in America at the moment is so large and overpowering that would have certainly overpowered this novel. And I thought it was more effective, just as in many plays, the unsaid thing in Ibsen, the thing that's off stage, actually the strongest influence in the piece. I felt there's an argument, now that you bring it up, there is an argument that this economic, social, and entertainment power that is America, we can see the glow of it, its flames all the way through Caledonia.
Right, so it's all the worst bits of America, but it doesn't have any of the good bits, Bethanne. I mean, I don't know. I'm a Brit in the US, so I see the good bits. Maybe I'm imagining.
You know, I see the good bits as well. And in fact, I'm even thinking about putting together some kind of list of the things we're going to miss, because there are going to be a lot of them that...
Like NATO.
Yeah. Women's reproductive rights. Yeah. A lot of little things, and right now I'm probably more focused on things like, good jazz and lobster rolls than I should be. I should probably be thinking much bigger. But this is something that I think goes right back to what the two of you were just discussing. Right now, some of us, we should be thinking about NATO, women's rights, justice, social justice. We should be thinking about, racism and what might happen in a new administration. I can barely say the word Trump. But we wind up thinking smaller. And I think that is, for several characters in Caledonian Road, exactly the problem. Let's not think about the big things. This is a true story. Before I got married, and my husband was a military officer for some decades, we went to the priest for marriage counseling, and he said, "What do you worry about?" And I said, "Well, I'm really worried about all these little manners and things. They're such a pain, calling cards and such." And he said, "Don't think about little things. Think about big things. What's the big thing you're worried about?" And I said, "Well, we're going to West Berlin, and I'm worried that there's going to be a call in the middle of the night. My husband will go off and be killed, and I'll be all alone." And he said, without missing a beat, "Bethanne, think about small things. Don't think about the big." So this to me, and apologies for taking over with my own.
It's really worth it.
But it's totally worth it for Caledonian Road, because
be careful, Bethanne. You're going to get in his next novel.
I'm already typing. You can't see what my hands are doing.
That's right.
Watch his shirt collars.
That's right. That's right. But in Caledonian Road, this is what Campbell thinks. Oh, well, life is terribly large and hard and difficult. So let me see what's my tipple today? And what shall we have for lunch? And when will Elizabeth and I sit out in the garden? But on the other hand, he knows that there are terrible forces coming to crush him. And those are some of his own making. But there's also a character that is Campbell's antithesis, if you will, his old friend William Byer. And
Yes.
I think this might be a way also to talk about the oligarchs, because William Byer isn't a particularly good person, is he?
I mean, among the sort of dark figures that one inevitably will find in a big social novel, William Byer for me was long in the making and very present in my life. There was no single model for William Byer, but there were many examples. Big businessmen during our time who gave a day-by-day demonstration in how not to look after your fellow man, to say nothing of your fellow workers, your employees. We saw the breakdown, if you like, of vigilance over such wayward business figures in Britain, also in America. I mean, America's interesting. We've been speaking about it a bit. In many of my other books, Math the Dog or In Be Near Me or Our Fathers, I grew up with a benign feeling about America. It gave us so much music, so much brilliant cinema. And I think one of the reasons that sort of we're detained by it is because in Britain, we really were attached to the vision of life that was offered in post-war America. But a lot of when we hit the skids that we hope to get out of course, but we hit them almost simultaneously with the United States. I mean, we had Boris Johnson during a lot of the years that I was writing this novel, and as the Americans had Trump, and they had a lot in common. Including, to return to your question, a kind of benign attitude to bent businessmen.
Yes.
Creating a kind of Casablanca atmosphere in our respective places of financial center. For corrupt businessmen to park their fortunes, to spend it on art invisibly using offshore accounts, to buy property using offshore accounts, and to be made welcome here. And I'm not just talking in the end about single politicians or even single political parties. The Labour Party under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair deregularized and gave golden visas to oligarchs.
Yes.
In a way that was a gate opener for people like David Cameron and Boris Johnson, who befriended these corrupt figures and encouraged them to do the dirty work that they were doing, allegedly. Now, I feel that was a rich part of our experience. Business figures like William Byer became the kind of satanic figures of our age, and there weren't enough novels that I was able to read that really characterized their condition, their mindset, their wastefulness, and showed what might happen to them. I had a lot of fun pursuing William Byer in this book. And
he's the British version of Harvey Weinstein in some ways.
I think so. I mean, and he also has such a wrecking ball attitude towards other human beings that as part of the drama of this book, I mean, we're having it was just inevitable that he was going to run into quite a lot of trouble. one of the exciting things we get to do now, because this book is being adapted as a major network series, is to think about who should play William Byer.
Oh, do I have ideas? Yes.
Please
Yeah.
direct message me all day and all night. I want all the ideas that people have, because we want to get this casting right. Some of those figures, I mean, you can almost, certainly after all my years of working with them, and I hope the reader has had this experience too, you can visualize them.
Yeah,
And
you certainly. We don't have a
these-
lot of time. I had two brief questions, and I'm sure Bethanne has a couple more. We haven't talked, Andrew, about another very, very dominant theme, I thought, at least in the book: fathers and sons. The narrative is driven by the dysfunctional relationship between a number of fathers and sons.
yes.
And I thought that was particularly interesting and depressing. And I also thought that the generation, you did such a good job on the aristocracy and Russian money and the corruption of the intellectual class and a lot of other stuff. But the one thing I was disappointed in the book was I thought you avoided the generational question. The young people in the book are either ideal types or ridiculously rich and successful. You avoid the generational question that, at least in America, and I think it's the same in the US, in the UK, of a lost generation, of people who aren't quite sure what to do with their lives. So perhaps address those two questions: that the fathers and sons element of the book, which is so strong and so depressing and interesting, but also the generational, my generational observation.
I think it's true what you say about the fathers and sons. I mean, that was for me a pattern that I wanted to pursue across classes. I wanted to show how a certain kind of breakdown in the handshake, if you like, that one would hope was traditional from father to son, like the sense of shared values, even with generational differences, that there was some sort of not allegiance necessarily, but certainly that not only in the DNA, but in the emotional and intellectual passing of the torch from one generation to another, that the fathers and sons understood the same language, that they shared some of the same values. I found when I looked at my characters in the inventing of them, that that's the thing they lacked, that there was a schism that had come about, that things had changed in society so fast in terms of technology and so on, that the fathers didn't really know what their sons were about.
And that's what's really the real father-son relationship. The one positive one that comes out of it, at least in my view, is the relationship between Cameron and Milo. Cameron is looking for a son. Milo, I guess, in a sense, is looking for a father. It's an odd relationship. In the end, it dominates the narrative of the book. But is there some promise of fathers and sons who may not share the same blood or even race?
I think, again, without giving it away for the readers who haven't made it to the book yet, I mean, the book is about resolution. It's my most optimistic book in a sense, that even the great adversaries at the center of this book are moving towards a notion of common ground all the time. They look so far apart. They look like they're speaking different languages. They look like they're from different worlds, never mind different generations. That's the dramatic problem. But as we move forward, we see that fathers and sons resolve, find, listen, and ultimately, I think, move on to each other's land in a way that they hadn't been at the very beginning. I don't think I agree with you that there's that the schism's depressing. I mean, it might be depressing to you personally, but...
Well, it's depressing on some of the fronts, but on others it isn't.
I mean, I like the notion that over the course of a big novel, the characters and the reader simultaneously go on a journey together to discover some unity, some unknown common ground. We spend the first half of the book watching that ground split beneath their feet. But later, I think they do find, even in adversity, especially in adversity for Campbell, he begins to be able to understand where he has been with those young people, what they were in his life. And I think that is something I share. I don't have a pessimistic view of the relationship between the generations. I say that as a father myself of a 20-year-old, where I feel, in fact, that for all the seismic differences across the gulf of the generations, there is this incredible sense of comedy and hope that can be kindled and grown. And that would be my submission to you. Whether that's everyone's experience of reading the book, I doubt. But for me, hopefulness is the golden thread here.
Well, it's interesting that you're talking about fathers and sons, because I believe your 20-year-old is a daughter, correct?
I actually have a trans son.
Well, and I am so glad that you are talking about that, because AJ clearly comes. I loved AJ. I thought
Yes.
they were a terrific character. And the reason I wanted to mention daughters is because the fathers and sons have a terrifically hard time. And I see what Andrew is saying, because Campbell and Angus never really resolve anything. And that might be because they share some very bad qualities and simply, can't find a common ground. But I wanted to say that Kenzie and Campbell, this lovely moment toward the end when they are meeting at the Ritz for tea, which they've done every year since she was a toddler in a tutu and little wellies. That had so much hope and so much power and love and compassion for me.
He just adores her.
He just adores her. And so there is this, he can't get through to his son. He and his son can't understand each other. But there is this thread of hope on the feminine side. And I don't want to take up all of the last few minutes, but I do want to say that I see that in some of the characters in Caledonian Road, including Gosha. So could you talk to that for a moment or two?
I think that, each novel has to be allowed to be its own discrete world. It's not the world.
Right.
And it can't answer all the problems, and it can't offer all the political solutions, and neither can it take on every theme to do with family life, fixing and arranging and sorting the novel stance, if you like, on every single problem. It can only focus on what seemed absolutely organic to the book itself, to these characters. I say these characters were specific. These men tend to have a problem with their sons. These men tend to love their daughters. That was the pattern that emerged. Now, I don't offer it as a whole picture of not only all societies, but even London society. There are plenty of fathers who are very close to their sons, But in this book, there was a common theme. In those men, I think, the older men were suffering a kind of crisis of generational confidence, which I wanted to anatomize, capture in a bottle once in this book. And equally, the relationship between so many of the characters, but especially the central character and his daughter, Kenzie, was, and there was a lot of autobiographical urgency in this for me, is just the adoring that child, regardless of gender. This Kenzie in the novel happens to be a very, interesting, dynamic lesbian who, was having a relationship with a gender non-specific individual, AJ, as you mentioned. And I wanted to play with that and play with those categories and allow the readers, because it's something that I think readers enjoy to do, meeting people on the page for the first time that they'll meet in life, perhaps. And these characters aren't that common on the page even yet in the context of a big social novel. So I had lots of interest in trying to animate all that, but centrally that relationship with Kenzie, I don't know, it was full of love to me, and it was a kind of oasis of uncomplicated love and adoration in the book that I simply wanted to water that plant all the way through this novel. And so much of my own personal affections and my own sense of the sort of redeemability of family life is in those characters.
In a sense, though, Kenzie is a good aristocrat. I mean, she inherits a fancy house. She doesn't really work.
And she decides to keep the fancy house as it is.
Again, this is the specific characters in a specific book. She's not a poster girl for decency, common humanity, great way to have relationships or anything else. None of my characters, let me say, in closing, really, as we're getting to that point, none of these characters should be held up as poster boys, girls, or anything in between for any of us. They are messes very often, but they are human messes, I hope. and the relationship with each other is earned and is, plausible.
Final questions. I have one final question, and then I'm sure Bethanne, and then we have you. I know you have to run. I'm not going to give away the ending of the book because we want everyone to read it, Andrew. But it's in my view, at least, it's an astonishing ending, and actually an ending that caught me completely by surprise. An absolutely brilliant ending. It's a shaggy book, for better or worse, but the ending is anything but shaggy. Did you know the ending? Were you writing the whole book with that ending in mind, or did it just somehow appear to you as you were finishing this thing?
So without speaking in code, I'll try and answer that question without giving away the end, but actually answering your question. I always knew that Campbell would be in the building that he is in at the end of the book.
Right, okay. I take that. And we all expected that, but not quite in the context.
No, so in the course of the
book, a Caledonian Road. That's yes.
I knew that he would be in a famous large building in Caledonian Road by the end of the book. That should set your audience off on a hair chase down the map of Caledonian Road.
But it also goes north. And I don't think that's a spoiler.
No, not at all. These clues are all welcome. But I did not know, I have to say, Andrew, that the exact technological details that are so crucial to that punch at the end would happen until I was well into the book. And I realized that it was the best way to deliver the dramatic denouement, the end, land this entire story of this great compendium of humanly different characters, to bring it to the point of the whole book, finally. Hopefully a generosity, an understanding, a fellow feeling, but also utterly to do with the internal mechanics of the book. And
if great artists don't have selves, I thought the ending was a piece of great art. What does that tell us?
Well, that you guys, are pointing towards something I think utterly true about all of us, that, as Norman Mailer once told me when I went to visit him for the Parish Review in Provincetown a year or so before he died, he said, the thing about being an artist, the thing about being a novelist is you use yourself up. There's less of you with each book. And the wraith that is presented to you right now is sort of disappearing fast. I don't know how much of myself I've got left for future books, but I felt I used a lot of myself up on this one. Norman was right.
Very generous. And you've been very generous with your time. Final question from Bethanne, and then I know you've got to run.
Well, thank you. And I do have a final question that I hope speaks to what you just said, Andrew O'Hagan, which is so much of this book, both bluntly, but also in a subtle way, is about asking how we stop the old stories, how we subvert them, how we change things for our families, for ourselves, for our society, for our government. What do you think you learned, used up as you are, about changing the old stories in the process of writing this book?
It's a beautiful question, that, Bethanne. I must say, the notion of all of us being confronted, whether as artists and writers or as readers and citizens, all of us are confronted with the problem of what do we do about the old stories? And my submission is that we write new ones, but we don't forget the old stories whilst writing them. This is a book which I try to make live with new notions of what the novel can do, new notions of technology, of generations, offering a new song, if you like, about how we live and what we're confronted with. But it was drawn on a template of the old Victorian novel. Therefore, the conversation at the center of this book is, as you very beautifully offer me a way to say, it's a conversation between the past and the present. And that for me is as much as I ever hoped could be done with a novel. When I was a little boy, borrowing books from the library and rattling bad stories out in my old plastic typewriter in Scotland, I hoped somewhere in my imagination that you could marry the old story to a new one. And that was my great hope with this book.
Well, Andrew O'Hagan, author of Caledonian Road, I want to thank you. Real honor to have you on the show. I have to get you back. I know you're about to come to the US to do some writing on American politics. Be interesting to get you back on to get your take on America. And thank you so much, Bethanne, our resident literary scholar, expert, reader. Great job, both of you, and congratulations, Andrew, on the book. What about Alec Baldwin in the television series?
Not bad, not bad. Can you do
Not bad for Bayer.